Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Koenig. I am a software engineer from Wellington in New Zealand, and you currently see me in my home office here. It's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon right now, and for the next 30-ish minutes or so, we're going to talk about Google Play Billing Library version 3, and particularly about what's new and what has changed and what are kind of the important things you need to know. Just one quick word in advance. I'm not working for Google. I'm just working with Google Play Billing Library a lot. So I'm not an official Google representative or anything like that. But nevertheless, I've used the library quite a bit, and there are some interesting things to have a look at from the latest release point of view. Let's start with this. So this is obviously Pokemon Go, a game that pretty much everyone knows. And I play it a lot and I enjoy it a lot. And to set the context and the stage for this talk, what would you think if you had to pay something like $50 or £50 or 50 whatever unit in your currency for this game outright, to buy it or to being able to play it? And obviously you would like that, because let's say $50 US is quite a big investment. So you would probably say no, go away. I don't want to pay that amount of money for that. And that's where Google Play Billing and in-app purchases and in-app subscriptions come into play, right? Because they give you an option to sell content or sell certain features in smaller packages after you get people interested into your app or your game or whatever kind of service you're selling. The underlying technology below the thing that we know as Google Play Billing Library is actually the Google Play in-app billing service. That's kind of a service that is quite low level, or seemingly low level in the Android operating system, and it's a service that allows you to sell digital content on the platform. And the emphasis is really on digital content here. This is not meant to sell physical goods. Quick overview, it supports more or less two different types of purchases. One is a one-off purchase, so consumable items or non-consumable items. And I don't want to go deeply into that, but roughly what it means is a consumable item is something that you can use and then buy again. So for example, 100 units of an in-game currency. You buy them, you consume them, which means they get kind of credited into your game account, and then you can buy another 100. Non-consumable items would be a one-off feature for an app. Let's say you have a drawing app and you buy a set of pencils or something like that, or a certain color scheme, things like that. Then we have recurring subscriptions, and subscriptions are ongoing payments that repeat themselves. So you would sell a membership to a certain service, for example, that way. That service can be accessed in two ways. You can use IPC, inter-process communication, or AIDL, or you can use the Google Play Billing Library. That's the modern way of dealing with this. The AIDL way is kind of what the billing service used to support, or used to be built on in the 2012, 2013 kind of time frame. But things have moved on to Google Play Billing right now. The billing library is available for developer preview since 2017 and has now reached version 3 just a few months ago. Okay, let's have a look at the library. And again, keep in mind, this is not an introduction talk to the library. I will give some context, but we will spend most of the time looking at specific features and problems. There is an introduction talk into the library available on droidCon.com as well that I gave at droidCon UK last year. So if you need kind of a introduction, maybe watch that at some stage as well. All right, so when we think about Google Play Billing as a library, the setup is you have a client, which is usually your handset, and you have at some point a server, which is usually kind of your backend of your app, which most people these days have in one way or another. The app is what your user interacts with. The app uses Google Play Billing Library at some point, and that communicates with Google Play, or the Google Play infrastructure on the handset. So for obvious reasons, you can't use Google Play Billing Library without, some sort of a Google Play setup. Google Play on the client interacts with a backend that Google provides, Google Play Server. That's kind of, the infrastructure that manages app purchases and it manages subscriptions. It's doing all that stuff that happens behind the scenes in the Google Play app for you. But also it communicates with a backend application. So, and that might be your own backend application where you say, I want to, store purchases in my own database, and I want to track purchases against certain users, which is kind of a common thing, particularly when you deal with subscriptions. And your backend application then has the ability to communicate with an API that is called the Google Play Developer API. That's a REST API where you can go and say, like, from my server to Google servers, I want to know the purchases of the last day, or I want to know which subscriptions a certain member has, for example. So it's a typical REST API. You can call backend to backend. The other interesting thing that the Google Play billing infrastructure provides are real-time notifications. And they also are based on the Google Play Developer API on Google's end. Then you need to have like a Google Cloud pub/sub setup that is allowing your applications or your backend to subscribe to notices. And usually that would be your backend application. So there might be a change in a subscription or in the status of a subscription or a purchase. You hook the Google Cloud publication subscription model in front of that, and that will automatically notify your backend application of that change, which is kind of handy and quite important. So from a 30,000 feet point of view, when you think about what that is and how it works, when you use the library in your app, you retrieve products, subscriptions, prices, you show all that stuff to the user. You can use it to check previous purchases. You can use it to purchase and start the purchase flow. And you can use it to start and cancel subscriptions or acknowledge purchases, for example. Other things on the backend, particularly on the Google Play Developer API, mean that you have to implement an integration between your server and their REST API. And you can use that to verify product purchases or subscriptions to pretty much avoid fraud. But it also helps you to be notified when the customer change or when customers change or cancel subscriptions, or anything else in the life cycle of a subscription might change at some point as well. The library itself is centered around a class called the BillingClient. And the BillingClient is kind of a setup that has a whole bunch of properties and is an abstraction layer to the underlying services. So you can see the BillingClient here, some of its fields and subclasses. It has a whole pile of listeners that actually notify your app of certain events happening in the life cycle of a product purchase or a subscription. And then you've got a whole bunch of helper classes like builders for various things, to build kind of purchase objects, to build certain flow objects, to build SKUs, which are products or product IDs more or less. So there's a whole layer of these kind of things. Another thing I just want to point out, reading the comments of the library code is super useful. So for example, there is like a whole section around the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act that I'm showing here. And you get like some really interesting and useful feedback. If you want to use this, you, for example, learn this is not quite fully implemented in all Google services. So looking at the library is something I generally recommend for a lot of use cases in a lot of scenarios. At the same time, here we can see an example of what happens behind the scenes, right? So if you use Google Play Billing Library to do something seemingly simple, like setting up a connection to the Google Play infrastructure, which is a 2 or 3 liner in Google Play Billing, these kind of things happen behind the scenes, right? So we're launching a new vending intent to go to the in-app billing service. That needs to be resolved. There is a whole lot of negotiating happening back and forth. And then at some point, the connection is made for you. So Google Play Billing Library is really a really nice abstraction layer that sits on top of all this effort to get to the actual billing service. When you look at some other parts of the library, you also notice that it supports different versions of the in-app billing service. And that makes it quite versatile when you look at using, older devices, which might have in-app billing service, but to a lesser spec, for example, and some particular features might not be supported. And that's all built into Google Play Billing. Right, so let's have a look at the Google Play Billing history a bit, because when we talk about the version 3 and what's new in it, we need to understand what kind of the origins of the library are. So it starts with 2017. There was a developer preview, and that was really well accepted by the developer community. And since then, there were 3 releases, or 3 major releases rather. 1.0 was kind of the initial release with the billing client, and it allowed you to do like, basic billing flows. You could manage SKUs, you could query existing products, and you could buy, or you could allow your user to buy one-off products or subscriptions. Cool. Then a few months later, 1.1 was released, which had in particularly much better callbacks for failure scenarios. So you could actually deal with things going wrong much better. And it introduced support for proration. So that means if, for instance, a user subscribes to something and then cancels, you can now start to give them partial refunds for the rest of the month, for example, if you want to. 1.2 came out about a year after the 1.0 release, and that had a big change, which was support for price changes in subscriptions. Before that, you couldn't do that. So if you were to actually offer a subscription for $10 US, the only option to change the price would be to more or less cancel the user at some point and then get them to subscribe to your new product for, let's say, $12. And now this is, much nicer in a nice UI flow where you say like, okay, I want to change the price, please, notify the users, and then the users have to obviously confirm that price change, and you can interact with that flow. There were a few more bug fixes, like 1.2.2 had a few tweaks. And the big thing here was that the underlying AIDL service started to use background threads. So that makes the whole thing much more efficient. And if you are still using BillingClient 1. something, you should really be on 1.2.2 and not on any of the older ones. That's just a side note. Then we have BillingClient version 2. That came out like around mid-2019. And that had a very massive change because all of a sudden the acknowledgement of a purchase is required. And what that means is if a user goes through the billing flow and they purchase some product or some subscription, and you don't go back to Google and confirm that actively, after 72 hours, your purchase will be voided. And that's clearly something you don't want, right? Because that effectively means you're losing a customer and you're losing money. So that acknowledgement step is super important to do with BillingClient 2.0. And a few people missed that quite easily and then were surprised that all of a sudden their customers got their money refunded. The other thing that was introduced here were pending purchases. And we'll talk about that a bit later. But that is essentially kind of a delayed purchase where you have a manual step in between. And there are certain use cases coming out of Google in the future, I think, where that will become quite interesting. The second item on this list here, the developer payload that can be passed to Google, that was cool, right? Because it allowed you to take some data, shove it kind of into your purchase package to the Google backend, and then that data would be passed through to you when you do like a backend to backend interaction. The problem is, as we see on the next slide, that was pretty much deprecated just a few months later for some reason. That happened in 2.2, which introduced Unity support, and that happened earlier this year. But now developer payload is gone already in favor of an API to pass obfuscated profile and account IDs through the billing process. And I can't really say what triggered that change. My assumption is people abused the developer payload for random things. And Google wanted to streamline that. And now you have exactly two options to pass data to Google and get it back out again, which is an account ID and a profile ID. And it has to be a hashed or obfuscated string in some way. The current release of the library, 3.0, had another new thing, which is purchase attribution instead of developer payload. It supports cash payments. That has to do with that pending payments concept I just mentioned a few moments ago. And it has a whole bunch of bug fixes and removal of deprecated functionality. The interesting thing is, looking at that list, you would not really think this is a major release, right? It's like, okay, that doesn't sound that great. But there are a lot of other things that kind of tie into Google Play Billing library releases that we're going to talk about next. And these are Play Store changes. So in general, the billing library sits in a quite wide context, right? It's not just the billing library you're dealing with. You actually deal with general policies and legislation. That might be tax changes, that might be, like child protection changes, for example, or, general regulatory changes that are pushed upon you. The Google Play Store has also its own features and its own policies. And even within Google, without input from the outside, things might change, right? And the people responsible for the Play Store might come up with new features that they want to introduce. And that goes hand in hand with the Google Play Billing library, or sometimes not. What I find is you're stuck in an ongoing cycle between features and libraries, more or less. So you have that continuous loop of there's a new feature in the library, and there is initial optional support for that in the Play Store. And then all of a sudden, that becomes the default behavior in the Play Store, and you have to manually take action to disable it potentially if you don't want that feature. And then a bit later, that feature all of a sudden becomes mandatory from a certain date onwards. And then the whole cycle, repeats itself again with some new feature Y coming into play. And there are typically one or two of these mandatory feature deadlines per year by which you have to get your stuff sorted, or your app is stopping to work, or doesn't support payments anymore, or other bad things can happen. When we look at the Google Play Billing Library update details, or the deadlines, you can see they roughly try to do one major release per year. So there is Billing Library 3 in 2020, assumingly 4 in 2021, etc., etc. And Billing Library 1 and 2 will not be supported from some point in 2021 on. 2022 will expire support for Billing Library 3, 2023 for Billing Library 4. And we'll come to that in a few minutes as well. So if we look at some of the most recent changes, one big one was acknowledging purchases and subscriptions. And I mentioned that briefly when we went through the library. What it pretty much means is, since version 2 of the library, you need to re-acknowledge any purchase or any subscription. It's kind of a manual callback, and you have to consciously make that. If you don't do that, it will be an automatic refund after 72 hours. And you have two options to do that. You can do it from the device using the Google Play Billing library with a method called acknowledge purchase, or consume async if you have a consumable product, or you do it on the backend to backend API via a REST endpoint purchases.subscriptions.acknowledge. I personally tend to do that on the backend because it's less error prone than doing it from the device, from my experience. But your mileage might vary. My really, really strong recommendation is do it, because otherwise you are going to lose money in your product and in your setup. Pending purchases, we briefly talked about as well. And that is the support for transactions that require some additional steps, right, in between purchasing or the purchase act and processing the payment. And usually that would be a cash scenario or a voucher scenario. So you could think of someone is going into a shop and they are buying some sort of a voucher that they have to punch in somewhere, and then they get access to your feature. That is also introduced in Google Play Billing Library 2.0. And so far, it's only applicable to purchases. So for subscriptions, that is not a problem or a scenario you have to deal with at all. But for purchases, for those one-off purchases, that could be something you're actually looking at some stage. The good thing, or what makes it a bit easier, is you have to actively enable it. It's not enabled by default because there is obviously kind of an acknowledgement that not everyone needs that at this stage. But the more Google Play branches out to the real world and vouchers and cash and shop payments, the more prominent this will become at some stage. In the Android client, you get access to kind of this pending state via query purchases or a function called getPurchaseState. The nicer way is to do it via the backend real-time notifications. So that's not via the API, but you can subscribe to a real-time notification that's called one-time product purchased, and that will give you information about the state of that purchase as well. Developer payload. So the use case for that is you want to pass through customer or member information in your payment request to your backend eventually, right? So you have to get it into Google Play Billing Library first, and then via the REST API or the real-time notifications, you actually retrieve it again. And that can be really useful because sometimes it's hard to tie a member ID or a customer ID for a subscription into your purchase. The workaround without developer payload would be to say, all right, the user purchases a subscription, I get acknowledgement from Google that that was successful, and then I actively send an HTTP call to my own backend from the app to transmit the member information and kind of merge member information and the purchase token and the purchase setup coming back from Google. But if you want to do that backend to backend without your app having to go to your backend, which could be another error-prone scenario, then this is a really nice, smooth flow, just passing the data through Google. That was introduced in Google Play Billing Library 2.0, very flexible. It was deprecated in 2.2 and removed in 3.0. So that's kind of a bit of a bummer, but it was replaced with set obfuscated profile ID and set obfuscated account ID. And what these two functions allow you to do is take your member ID or your customer ID or whatever kind of, whatever you call this information, hash it or obfuscate it in some way, then pass it through Google. And on the other side, use the Google Play backend API, either via the subscription purpose endpoint or the product purchase endpoint, and retrieve it again and do whatever you need to do with it in your own backend. That's kind of a useful replacement. It's available from Google Play Billing Library 2.2. And if you're moving to 3.0, just remember that the original developer payload is not supported anymore and is gone. So you have to swap to this obfuscated setup with account ID and profile ID. One of the new features that came into effect just recently, in November 1st, is restoring subscriptions. So the scenario here is a user cancels a subscription, but it's not yet expired because it's active for whatever the subscription period was, right? If you have like a 3-month subscription and they cancel after the first month, they still have access for 2 more months to the whole thing. So if you're in that state, you can give the users the option to restore it. That used to be optional, but since the 1st of November, that is required. And you have to support it, basically. What happens is users get communication from Google Play that they can do these kind of things. So if they go back to the Google Play app, they actually see a resubscribe or restore button for the subscription that is kind of in that canceled but not yet expired state. And what I find is if your app doesn't have a backend, this is quite hard to support properly. The best way to do it is with a real-time notification called subscription restarted, because then that tells your backend, oh, that user is coming back. And now you need to, enable all the features again to support whatever that user has purchased. In general, you'll find that if you don't have your own backend, if you are kind of in that mindset, I just have an app, I don't need a backend at all, you will struggle with a lot of the new subscription features to support them properly. Another one of these is account hold. And that occurs when a subscription falls into kind of a scenario that a payment fails. And 99% of that is obviously a credit card that is expired. So it can't be renewed. And basically what will happen is the user has the option to hold the account for like 30 days, and they can fix the payment issue. Again, that used to be an optional feature, and it became mandatory to support from 1st of November 2020 on. And again, users get communication from Google Play if that occurs, so you need to do something about that. The proper action is you want to disable users' access to the features that they used to have paid for, and communicate that with them. So when they log in the next time, you will say like, hey, your credit card is expired. Please go to the Google Play app and fix that for me. Right? If your app doesn't have a backend, once again, super hard to support properly. The best way is to do that with real-time notifications called subscription on hold and subscription recovered. And that will tell your backend when the state of the subscription from the users changes, and then you can enable or disable certain features again. There's another new feature called pause, and that's kind of account hold, but user triggered. So it gives the option to your user to pause a subscription from something like 1 week up to 3 months. And that can be nice because, if a user just maybe goes away on holiday or doesn't use your app for a while, you can give them that grace period and still keep them on your app. However, that used to be an optional feature. And what has changed on 1st of November here is it is now enabled by default. So if you don't do anything, you have to support pause. If you don't want that, you have to go into the Google Play console and actually switch off the pause feature. And it's a quite complex flow. I would say it's the most complex flow in that whole subscriptions ecosystem. We'll have a quick look. So scenario, user pauses and then enters account hold. On the left, we start with like user at some point subscribes or renews. Then they decide to pause it. That's kind of in the middle between T1 and T2. At some stage, T2 comes. That's the day when their original paid period ends. They are in pause state for a certain amount of time. And then at T3, they might not pay after their pause. And then the user's account automatically falls into on hold. So you have another kind of forced pause at the end of that. And you can see like in that bottom line how there are like various notifications being sent to your backend. And that's why for these kind of flows, you really need to have these real-time notifications. This is a similar scenario. User pauses and then they resume the subscription. So the only difference is here after the pause, they end up actually with an active subscription right away because it is treated like a renewal at that stage. And then we have finally a thing called resubscribe, which is very similar to the restore feature. But the difference is here, this is a subscription that is canceled and already expired. Again, since the 1st of November, this is enabled by default in Google Play. So you don't have to use it, but you have to switch it off if you don't want to use it. If your app doesn't have a backend, proper support tricky. The way how it works is it is essentially restoring a subscription, but you get a new purchase token. A purchase token is kind of an encrypted hashed string that identifies a transaction in Google Play. And in a restore setup, you will actually just keep your existing purchase token because you're just restoring the subscription. A resubscribe will produce a new purchase token and then give you a linked purchase token field that points to the old one, to the original subscription, so to say. And just to give you a bit of an overview, the subscription lifecycle can be challenging sometimes. You know, you have like a variety of states, and then depending on what you're doing, either in the Google Play billing library, which is the second column, or in the backend API, which is the third column here, you get sometimes different responses, and they can be sometimes unexpected. So this is a really handy table and chart to have a look at to make sense of, you know, what certain return values, depending on where you run stuff, might mean. And I find generally the backend is more reliable and it makes more sense, because BillingClient query purchases has a lot of dependencies on the Play Store, on caching data on the device, and that can sometimes lead to unexpected or misleading setups where you think like, oh, okay, I wouldn't have expected this to happen. So what is next? If you're still using AIDL or Google Billing Library 1 point something, at least hopefully you're on 1.2.2, you need to be off that either way by mid-2021, because it will not be supported anymore. So depending on when you start, you might actually, if you do it now, end up implementing Google Play Billing Library 3 or potentially a future 4 point something release, depending on when that comes out in 2021. When you migrate from AIDL, then pretty much everything will be new to new. And that's cool, because it means you don't really know about this history of Google Play Billing Library 1 and 2. The biggest thing you probably will experience when you come from 1.x to 3 or 4 is that you have to acknowledge your purchases, and that can really bite you. And there is a whole lot of new subscription behavior to stick and support. If you're currently on Billing Library 2.0, it's easier. You still have to be off 2.0 by mid-2021, because that's when support for it ends. And you still would end up with 3 or 4. But my recommendation would be to do that now and just bite the bullet and move to Google Play Billing Library 3, because it's a very smooth migration. So I recently did that for an app, or for like a set of 30 apps actually. And it took me about like half a day for the actual migration and the code changes. And then there were a few other things that we had to support additionally on top of that in the subscription area. But it's not, you know, a major piece of work usually that you have to undertake here. And everyone else, I think it's just important that you don't only look at the billing library releases, because it's misleading. You need to look at the wider ecosystem, and you need to see every billing library release in conjunction with the Google Play Store policy, and with feature changes, and with those deadlines they have for certain things to become mandatory. Because if you miss them, your app will stop making you money, quite unfortunately. That is pretty much it. Thanks a lot for having joined the talk. Here are some ways to get in touch with me: email or my website or Twitter handle. The slides will be on Speaker Deck a bit later today, in a few hours, or after my talk. The next 2 slides are a bunch of resources which will be on the Speaker Deck link as well, so I'm not going to show them. Instead, I'm going to open the floor for questions if anyone has questions they want to ask. Okay, let me have a look. Why don't support API for purchase consume? One-time products. No, consume is not for subscriptions. Consume is for one-off purchases. The way how it works is like a subscription is pretty much an ongoing renewal thing, and you don't have to consume a subscription. Subscriptions are kind of consumed by default, more or less, if that makes sense. A product or like a one-time product, that's where you can say, like, I want to, for example, that example with game coins, right? I buy I buy a product which is 100 game coins, and then I can't buy that again, unfortunately, because Google Play doesn't allow to hold multiple instances of the same product in a Google Play account. So if you want that, it essentially means you have to consume it. That tells Google Play it becomes available again, and you can buy another set of 100 game coins or whatever currency you wanna use. Cool. Any more questions? I'll give it a few seconds because people might scan the barcode or type the question. No, that potentially seems to be it. Then again, thanks a lot for having joined my session. I hope you got something useful out of it. Oh, there's one more question coming. I just see that popping up. Oops. Let's just quickly answer that because we have like another 3 or 4 minutes left. How is transition from free trial to paid handled here? All right, so that's not really a big area where I have a lot of expertise, because the free trial is something we haven't used a lot, or I haven't used a lot with the apps I work on, because they are essentially using a different free trial system, and they're not really leveraging the Google Play billing free trial setup for subscriptions. However, that being said, what normally happens is you can set up your app that it supports free trial in general, and you can define how long a free trial is going to be available for people. And what it means is, after you, they still have to sign up or subscribe to your app, obviously, your customers. And what basically happens is, for the first month, that gets prorated, essentially. So it is a seamless transition for the user. But what means, if they subscribe for, like, let's say 1 month, and you give them a 7-day trial, that delays kind of the start of the actual paid subscription in that end. Right. Any more questions? Okay, so we have another 1 minute or 1.5 minutes left. Let's just finish it here. Again, thanks a lot for having joined the talk, and I hope you got something useful out of it. If you have any more questions, shoot me a mail or send me a message on Twitter, or get in touch with me in one of the ways I've showed on the slides. And otherwise, let's enjoy the rest of droidCon APAC. Thanks a lot. Yeah.